Pentagon moved into phase one of reopening in June, but operations looked a lot different. DoD made social distancing mandatory for mission essential personnel and maximized telework and other stay-at-home options for vulnerable populations. Let's learn more about the long-term implications now. Lisa Hershman's the Chief Management Officer at the Department of Defense. Ms. Hershman, welcome. It's good to talk to you again. What lessons have you learned from the closure and the reopening of the Pentagon and other locations that it could apply in some type of similar pandemic response or could apply just to operations of the department overall?
Francis, thank you. It's good to see you again, and thanks for having me. Great question and an important one. So we learned a lot. First of all, we learned that what we assumed was that we had a plan like this in place before something like this pandemic hit, and in actuality, we did not. And so we were learning about this pandemic and creating a plan to keep our employees safe at the same time. So we learned that, number one, we can react swiftly and appropriately to put the employees' best interests ahead of everything else, as well as stay on mission for the department. Number two, we really shattered the myth that you cannot do any work at DoD via a telework situation. That has significantly changed. And number three, we learned that it takes a true collaborative approach in having the interests and the needs of all of our organizations and our services to weigh in on what is needed so that we don't inadvertently make policies or processes that have good intentions to help one constituency and inadvertently hurt others. So there was a lot of things to be considered. We learned that a lot of communication, a lot of meetings, a lot of sharing. I mean, we were having in the very beginning meetings every single day, and it was not uncommon for me to have 6 and 7 hours of COVID meetings through the weekends just to make sure that everybody was properly communicating, sharing information, and learning together.
The number two one there, the telework issue, I think, is the one that has generated the most interest over the last several months. What have you learned specifically about that work? You said you've shattered the myth that work can't be done in remote locations. What does the narrative look like now about what work can be done remotely versus what has to be done on premises? Who can do that work, the kinds of people that can telework that maybe didn't before, and what's your sense of how that all shakes out and what a telework posture broadly across the department looks like in a post-COVID environment, Lisa?
Mm-hmm. So you're right. When I came on board with first joined the DoD, my first time in government, it was in April of 2018, and one of the first questions I asked was, what's your telework policy? Now, coming from the private sector, this was something that was very natural to me. And the response I got was, well, we largely work with classified information, and so we don't have the ability to do that. But what we learned very quickly was that not everyone works with classified information, and even those that do, it's not always 100% of their time. Certainly we have certain roles that would be the exception to that statement, but certainly there are transactional type of work and meetings and things like that that don't involve classified work, and so those types of things we could accommodate more readily through a telework situation. So we have started to relook at what is the mix if we look at certain positions and the position descriptions, how much of it is feasible to do in a telework situation. So we started there. Then we're talking to many of the employees and we're getting their input. As a matter of fact, we're working with, I have 2 experts on my team, one with a master's and one with a PhD in surveys, and we're leveraging that talent to find out, is it optimal to work from home? Is it optimal to work in the building, or is a combination of maybe part of the time in the building and part of the time at home? What's the optimal situation for the employee and for the output? We also did some studies, informal studies with certain roles, and tracked their performance during the COVID and when they were teleworking. And we found in some situations, especially highly transactional work, they were more productive. In one instance, in Washington Headquarters Services, we had an individual that was 30% more productive. And when we asked why, they indicated a lot fewer interruptions and a lot fewer meetings that I really have to attend. And so we're learning from that and capturing that information.
So that comports with what I'm hearing both in the national security community and across the enterprise of the government as a whole, Lisa. But I wonder where you start to measure trade-offs in respect to what you talked about issue number 3, and that's that collaborative approach. Is that collaborative approach suffering at all as a result of the humans not being in the same room together? Or are you seeing maybe an acceleration of that because of the focus that they're able to bring when they do collaborate, whether it's virtually or whether they have to come into the building on a more sporadic basis?
It's interesting. The one area I've noticed where collaboration has increased is across agencies. So many of us were in the same situation that DoD was, with not necessarily having a plan in place. And so it has created a lot of across government agency collaboration and benchmarking and learning from each other. So that's where collaboration has actually improved. From within the building, there's pros and cons to both. So when I find that we are doing either video conferencing meetings or just via the telephone, the meetings are much more efficient. We get to the point, we get through the agenda in usually a more efficient manner. However, what's lost, and what became very apparent, is how much informal work and connection and sharing of information happens, and that's been lost. And that's why I've been encouraging people to look at what's the right combination. You know, we don't think about part of the time being in the building for certain types of work and then part of the time being home. And this could lend itself to more flexible schedules and not all the time in the building, all the time teleworking. We are experimenting with how do we create some combination that's right for the role and as well as being right for the individual.
I want to talk about each of the 4 directorates in the CMO office, and I'd like you to think about each of those as we talk through them in the context of how COVID has either reordered the priorities that each of those directorates is undertaking, or how they might look different post-COVID than they did pre-COVID. Anywhere like that you'd like to take them, Lisa. And the first one is the Data Insights Directorate. What's different or what's changing there as a result of COVID, or what could be different at some point in the future in the way that particular directorate does what it does?
So let me answer this from 2 aspects. Number one, they were probably my first directorate to move out very quickly to go all telework. And so because that team, a lot of data analytics that's happening, they access tools and repositories remotely, they were able to move out fairly quickly. So it did have a big impact on how Michael Conlin runs that team and manages that team. What had a huge impact on them was tapping into their analytics capabilities as we started to gather data on COVID, especially in the beginning stages when we were learning about COVID and what metrics we should be tracking, and everything from how many people are teleworking, how many people are in the building, how many people were starting to become symptomatic, and that team, using tools like Advana that was created with by the comptroller that our team works with very closely, became the go-to source for all of our data that we were using DoD-wide for COVID. So it had a pretty significant impact on that team. Now, not just COVID related, but now we talk about the business of what the OCMO was trying to do when the pandemic hit. For the first time, we were running a unified budget build for all of the defense-wide organization. Many folks refer to it as the fourth estate. And so we had to shift our priorities, and this had an impact on the data insights team, to move to largely unclassified work, for folks that were in the building. And now as people are coming back, we're starting to get into that classified work. That definitely had an impact on that data insights team because they were involved in many of our reform initiatives as well.
A quick sidebar, if I might, Lisa, before we move to the transformation and reform Directorate. With the movement of the CDO out of your office and now reporting to the CIO, Dana Deasy, what impact does that have on the Data Insights Directorate?
Well, not a huge impact. Michael Conlon is now my Chief Business Analytics Officer, and he is now focused on specific analytics and metrics and repositories and access to data, working closely with the CIO, but we're focused on the business portion of it and not necessarily weapon systems data and things like that. So it's more looking at the business operations side.
When Congress created what was then the DCMO office, I think transformation and reform was probably the biggest bucket that they envisioned that office undertaking. What does that look like today, and how has COVID changed it? What's the evolution in that directorate that you expect to see post-COVID, Lisa?
So part of that team, we are working very closely on this defense-wide approach. Secretary Esper had given me some marching orders in January and said, I want you to be my Secretary of the Fourth Estate. So we were looking at everything from that unified budget build and going through the POM process in a unified way. And on top of that, which if you're familiar with this, often that involves folks offering up reductions and cuts. And for the first time ever, I'm very excited that that team is now looking at, in lieu of cuts, because I'm not a believer in across-the-board cuts. I think some areas could maybe take larger reductions, and others need investment instead of cutting. And so that team has become very closely involved with replacing cuts with reform initiatives instead. So that being said, again, looking at unclassified work and what we could do in that in those instances where we keep that classified piece out of it. And also, we're used to having reform management group meetings that are in person. It was very challenging because when you have large number of people that have to participate in a meeting, it gets more challenging for teleconferencing. People start to talk over each other. It becomes challenging. But putting that aside, the team was still able to keep the regular battle rhythm of reform management group meetings. There was still a lot of decision making going on. We wove in reform into part of that unified budget build and the POM process, just in making sure we understood that we had to do unclassified work first and then iterate again with the classified work. So the priorities have remained the same, and we continue to move forward on our reform initiatives. Probably one of the reform areas that was really impacted the most because of COVID was our medical and healthcare system reform initiatives. Many of those same resources were necessary to address specifics on the COVID response. And so while we have seen some slip in some of the schedules, we are now working on how to make up for that and how do we overcome to ensure the outcomes are not compromised.
We have about 4 minutes left, Lisa, and so I don't want to disrespect either your teams in the Oversight and Compliance Directorate or Administration and Organizational Policy Directorate, so I'll just propose that you talk about either or both of those in the time that we have left. Again, what it looked like pre-COVID, how COVID has affected it, and where you see those directorates going in a post-COVID world.
So, the Oversight and Compliance team also had a big role in some of the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, within their own directorate, I think it took them probably a little bit longer to adjust to a telework situation, considering the nature of their work. However, between March 2nd and June 23rd, the regulatory compliance team processed almost 400 short suspense interagency regulatory actions from across the federal government. So these regulations had a very significant impact on federal government's ability to respond to and support the COVID-19 relief efforts. So while it took a little time adjusting to a new work style, as I said, they probably had had the greatest challenge with shifting to telework. They did a remarkable job in redirecting their priorities and their resources to help with this government-wide response. So, and they got creative. I mean, they even did MS Team meetings where instead of their pictures, they had pictures of the Muppets. So they tried to keep a little bit of levity in some very tough times. But I'm very proud of all of my directorates for doing just yeoman's work during these challenges.
We have a little bit more than a minute left, Lisa. What's the benefit that you think the department has derived from the construct of your office and the directorates and the work that you've done over the last 3 months? And how will that benefit continue to produce benefits, do you think, down the road?
Wow, that's more than a minute response, Francis, but I'll give it my best shot. So we have realized, validated $11.2 billion in savings. We have identified opportunity for in excess of another $8 billion in opportunity. And of course, we still are working through the details of how that gets realized. But I am so proud that every dollar that we have found has gone directly to supporting the servicemen and women that serve this country so honorably. And so I'm very proud of that. We've introduced reform as a replacement to across-the-board cuts. That's something very new for this organization. We've brought in best practices from industry, and we're teaching folks how to leverage data for good decision-making and analytics. So those are the wave tops.
Very much appreciate your time today, Lisa. Thanks very much for talking about the work that your office is doing and what it looks like moving forward. Up next, a deep dive into the National Defense Authorization Act, the House Armed Services Committee's wish list, poison pills, and long-term view of the DoD budget. You're watching NATSEC 2020, Coronavirus and Beyond on GovMatters Conference TV, presented by Splunk. I'll be right back.